Our cerebrum is a hemispherical structure, we know that. It has been divided into different lobes, 4 lobes namely, and the name of each lobe is given according to the skull bone which encloses it. So we have 4 lobes, and now we are going to study in this lesson the function that each lobe performs. Now you know there are certain grooves in the brain has that convoluted sort of structure. Those grooves which are present, they separate the lobes from each other, and the 4 lobes according to the skull bones that we have with us is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. As the name suggests, all the 4 of them have the names of the skull bones itself. Again, I am repeating it. Now these lobes, they are separated by certain grooves which are present in the cerebral hemisphere, and you have to remember that each side, right cerebrum as well as the left cerebrum side, each side is having these lobes. So if we in totality see the cerebrum, you are going to find 2 frontal lobes, 2 parietal lobes, 2 temporal and 2 occipital lobes, because over here when I talk about each lobe, it is half of the cerebrum that is being considered. That means supposedly this is the cerebrum which is having this, I would represent it like this. See, there are so many convulsions over here, something like this, that is the cerebrum. This is the central sulcus that separates the cerebrum into 2 hemispheres. This one, this right side would have the 4 lobes and the left side would have 4 lobes individually. So we have 4 lobes that are present. Now what you have to remember is that if we see one part, now supposedly you have brain in your hand like this, you're not seeing it like this, rather you're seeing the brain like this the brain is being observed. You would find all the 4 lobes in each side, and the other side would be seeing the rest of the 4 lobes. So we have the 4 lobe arrangement in such a way that each hemisphere is having its own lobe. The cerebral hemisphere is having each lobe, 4 lobes in each side. Now talking about the frontal lobe, you must have noticed that whenever somebody is thinking, or there is a lot of thinking process that is going on, we often do it like this, that there is a lot of stress in the mind, we are thinking and the rest of the process. So basically we are targeting our frontal lobe over here. What are the functions of frontal lobe? This is the most important lobe. Before coming to the functions, you need to know that inside the frontal lobe there are few terms that you need to remember. I am writing them over here for the ease of writing. Basically, there is a central sulcus that is present. Now what is sulcus? Sulcus is that fissure sort of thing, that like this. There are gyrus and sulcus, we have discussed in the brain structure. Now this central sulcus, what it does, it separates the motor area. We are talking about frontal lobe over here, the motor area and the somatosensory cortex. Now inside the brain, if you have a brain caricature in your hand, you are not going to find the things mentioned that this is the motor area or this is the somatosensory area. You have to see it that it is the frontal lobe, and there would be a great fissure present in it, ditch like thing that is known as central sulcus, that divides the motor area and the somatosensory area. As the name suggests, this motor area is going to perceive and tell whatever is to be done by the brain, and the somatosensory area would be for somatic sensation. The sensory system would send the signals over here, they would be processed over here, the information would be channelized and it would be sent to the motor area, from where whatever actions are to be carried out, they would be transcended by the brain. Now next thing is knowing about the functions of each lobe individually. The inner monitoring of complex thoughts and actions that our brain does is taking part in the frontal lobe. Again, I told you that thinking and rest of the things that we come across, often we say that the brain is functioning, that's why the head is paining over here. That is because the inner monitoring in complex thoughts, the creative ideas, whatever is happening, the entire processing, the memory part, all these things take place in the frontal lobe. Then there is translation of memory to the actions. The memory basically is about the muscular actions we have to discuss over here. The actions which are to be brought about would be by the muscles. So there is the memory which is being created in the frontal lobe, and how that memory is to be translated into muscular actions, that is also carried out in the frontal lobe only. Apart from that, the processes like reasoning, decision making, expression, emotion, willpower, personality, and whatever you can relate with the individual's basic behavior, that is taking place in the frontal lobe. These are the processes basically which are carried out by the frontal lobe. So, you come to know that it is the memory part, thinking part, behavior part, that all has to take place in the frontal lobe. Have a look to all these functions and try to cram them by heart, because these are the important functions, and frontal lobe basically is the think tank of the brain, if we have to call it. Now coming to the parietal lobe, we get little bit side towards, this is important for registration of sensory perception of touch, pain, heat and cold. Now I need not to say that the nerves which would be connected to various receptors in the body of touch, that is mechanoreceptors. We have a detailed discussion of receptors as well in our syllabus. The touch, pain, heat and cold, the thermoreceptors as well as mechanoreceptors, they are perceived, and the information which is sent by them to the brain, that processing and registration, that means perception basically, that takes place in parietal lobe. Next thing is that the knowledge about position and space, that means the posture making process. Apart from cerebellum, cerebellum is a part of brain which is important for maintaining the postures and equilibrium. How do we know that we are standing in a correct position? That is also being perceived, and the parietal lobe plays an important role in that, with the functioning of cerebellum, of course. Then we have perception of information from the environment, whatever the environment is. That means, because we have discussed over here, the sensory perception by various receptors is being done by parietal lobe. The perceiving on information from the environment, it means the similar thing only, because the sensory perception covers this thing. And then once the perception has taken place, what happens is this information has to be organized in a proper way and has to be sent to the rest parts of the brain, so that this process information that was taken up, that is organized and it gets processed somewhere, and that processing position of the brain, or the processing part of the brain, would be cerebellum, as we have mentioned. So parietal lobe is important for perception and registration of sensory these receptions, which is touch, pain, heat and cold, and rest of the things that we talk about, they have an important role for environmental perceptions only. Now the third one is temporal lobe. Temporal lobe, you know, this temporal bone, it is situated near our ears. So, and ears are very important for collecting sound, and then those receptors in the ear, they are important for telling what is being spoken about. Like what I am telling, what I am speaking over here, it would be perceived in the temporal lobe. Over there would be decoding and the interpretation. Now when you hear the sound, you're not listening to what I am speaking like blah blah blah. It is not like that. You are getting to decode each and every word. You are trying to understand what I am saying. So that decoding and interpretation of the sound that is coming from any source, that would be done in the temporal lobe. And apart from that decoding, there is a language comprehension as well. That is why the human brain is so much accustomed and so much advanced, because it has these all functions which are carried out in the cerebrum, out of which one is the language comprehension. You know that birds also hear to the sound, they also respond to the sound, but this language comprehension part is very important for the human brain. Apart from this listening process, that is the interpretation of sound and language comprehension, the smell, memory and emotion at times are regulated by the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe has the function of perceiving and in return processing the information regarding the smell receptors, memory and emotion. And the last one is occipital lobe, which is towards at the last end, that behind temporal lobe again, that is responsible for decoding of visual information. That means the occipital lobe would be in contact with the supply from the optical area. So this has something to do with the eye part, that is from where the visual information comes, it is perceived received, it is processed inside the occipital lobe of the brain. So we have the 4 lobes, and when we talk about the lobes, we are basically talking about cerebrum. So each part of the cerebrum has these 4 lobes, and each lobe is incessantly working and continuously working and working, so that we have a proper understanding of whatever is happening in the environment. In return, we have proper processing of whatever is happening in the environment, and our brain works in the most coordinated way, and not to miss, in a very speedy way, which is not of any match, which is having no match in the entire world.